So welcome everyone to this Jewish Studies event. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for joining online. I'm just going to introduce our speaker and then we will take it away. So Matthias Henze is the Isla Carroll and Percy E. Turner Professor of Biblical Studies at Rice University in Houston, Texas, and the director of Rice's program in Jewish Studies he founded in 2009. A native of Hanover, Germany, a Master of Divinity from the University of Heidelberg in Germany, Henze moved to the US to pursue a PhD in Harvard's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He completed his PhD in 1997 and immediately joined the faculty of Rice's Department of Religion. Since 2024, he has been a fellow of the Orion Center for the Study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Associated Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has held several other prestigious fellowships in the United States, in Germany, and in Israel. Dr. Henze is the author or editor of 14 books and numerous articles and book chapters. Among other interests, including the history of a biblical interpretation, biblical ethics, he's a renowned expert on Jewish apocalyptic literature. The lecture for this evening focuses on one dimension of his research on ancient Judaism, concepts of time, and the end of time. Please welcome my good friend, Dr. Matthias Henze.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming. I see lots of students in the room. I'm delighted you're here. It's wonderful for me to be at Fordham, and I'm looking forward to an evening of learning together with you. What is time? That question, obvious as it may seem, has preoccupied thinkers at least since antiquity. Already the great Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle over 2 millennia ago, and since then many other great intellectuals, have attempted to describe what exactly time is. Plato, for example, thought that time exists independently of the events that occur in time. The idea is that time can exist without change. Imagine all forms of motion or change suddenly grinding to a halt. Birds freezing in midair, people freezing in mid-sentence, students freezing in the middle of an exam. No, wait, that actually happens. Everything coming to a halt for, say, a week or a month or so. But at least according to Plato, time would still continue. In his view, time is really its own thing that can be compared perhaps to an empty container into which things and events can be placed, but it exists independently of what is placed in it. Aristotle strongly disagreed and had a very different view. For him, time is not independent of the events that occur in time. Time is essentially related to change. Things that are now are no longer as they were yesterday or a month ago. On Aristotle's view, we cannot recognize change without time, nor time without change. In other words, when we think and talk about time, we are really talking about temporal relations among things and events. The great thinkers of the early church picked up on the subject of time, most significantly Saint Augustine. In his Confessions, written during the years 397 through 401, Augustine devotes all of Book 11 to the subject of time and eternity. In an often quoted passage, he reflects on the difficulty to express exactly what time is. Quote, "We know perfectly well what we mean when we speak of time, and understand just as well when we hear someone else refer to it. What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. And if I want to explain it to someone who asks me, I do not know. I can state with confidence, however, that this much I do know. If nothing passed away, there would be no past time. If there was nothing still on its way, there would be no future time. And if nothing existed, there would be no present time. Now, when we turn our attention to ancient Judaism, which is the subject of our meeting today, we find nothing equivalent to Plato, Aristotle, or Augustine. There are no ancient writings, ancient Jewish writings explicitly on time, texts that are devoted to an investigation of the nature of time. Jewish intellectuals of late antiquity did not reflect on the passage of time in abstract philosophical terms, like Augustine did in his Confessions. But this, of course, hardly means that they do not have a notion of time. They did, but hardly ever did they make their thinking explicit. We have to extrapolate their notions of time from their texts. And there is a second difficulty. Ancient Jewish writers did not share a single uniform understanding of time that is found widely and can thus be condensed and summarized in a few sentences. Ancient Judaism is characterized above all by its diversity of thought and viewpoints. And yet I submit to you, and this is really the central argument of my paper tonight, that there are a number of aspects with regard to time and temporality that recur frequently in the library of ancient Judaism. Some have roots in the Hebrew Bible, and others, I would argue most of them, are developed for the first time during the late Second Temple period, when thinking about time in critical terms became of interest to Jewish intellectuals. My task tonight is to identify and to describe briefly some of these aspects of time in ancient Judaism, if only because when taken together, they inform us of how ancient Jewish thinkers made sense of the passage of time. But first, a word on terminology. When I speak of ancient Judaism, I refer to a rather specific period in the history of Judaism. What you see on this slide is a timeline of what we can call Second Temple period. You see the dates at the bottom of the slide. It begins right after the Babylonian exile with the Persian period and the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. And it ends when the Second Temple is destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era. The Second Temple period is commonly further divided into the Persian period, the Hellenistic period, the Maccabean period, and the Roman period. When I refer to ancient Judaism tonight, I specifically mean a slice of the Second Temple period, the time between the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE that ushered in the Hellenistic period, and the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE. Or, in Jewish terms, this is the time from the rise of Hellenism to the Bar Kokhba revolt, a period of around 400 to 500 years or so. This period, the time of ancient Judaism, is well worth our attention. As you can see on this slide, it was during this time that the last books of the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh were written. But the end of the Hebrew Bible did not mean the end of writing, of course. Quite to the contrary. This was a period of unprecedented creativity and immense literary production. Only that these writings have been largely forgotten and hence aren't as well known today. They include also the Dead Sea Scrolls, rediscovered in the 1940s and 50s. They include texts that we call today the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. And all of the New Testament was written toward the end of this period. If we want to get a sense of how ancient Jewish intellectuals thought about time and temporality, we need to look at all of these texts together. So here's what I'm going to do. I will structure my remarks in form of 5 theses or 5 observations. I will go through these theses one by one, and then read with you a number of passages from the primary or ancient texts that illustrate each observation that I will make. So here we go. Observation number 1. the end of time. The most basic pattern used by ancient Jewish thinkers to structure time was the belief in two consecutive ages. The present age, which is marred by decay, suffering, and death, is about to be replaced by a future transcendent age, which is envisioned as a time of eternal bliss, in which evil will be vanquished and creation will finally flourish as God had intended it in the beginning. The writers of the Tanakh did not know of an age to come. Whenever they expressed their hope for salvation, as they do frequently, salvation is expected to come within this world, not in an imagined future eon. The absence of such a hope for a hereafter is perhaps felt nowhere more acutely in the Hebrew Bible than in the book of Psalms. Ever so often, the psalmists relate a near-death experience. Faced with their own end, these individuals implore God to intervene, lest they descend into the pit from which there is no return. Notoriously absent from the Psalms is the belief that one day in the eschatological future, the life of the psalmist will be restored to them and the dead will rise again. The biblical Psalter, the descent into the netherworld, is irrevocable and there is no justice in it. This view changed during the Second Temple period, when believers first conceived of a hereafter or a age to come. Note, for example, this statement in a text known as 4th Ezra, an Apocalypse from the late 1st century. For this reason, the Most High has made not one world, but two. Ancient Jewish writers stopped short of providing many specifics about how this age to come will look like. But there are some features in the description of the two ages that recur frequently in the texts. For one, there is a pervasive sense of urgency, that time as we know it is running out, and that the age to come is close at hand. This notion is found widely, and it is expressed rather poetically by the author of 2nd Baruch, another apocalypse of the late 1st century CE. I quote, "For the youth of the world has passed, and the strength of creation is already consumed. The advent of the times is very near, they have passed by. The pitcher is near to the well, the boat to the harbor, the journey to the city, and life to its consummation." Instead of engaging in speculative calculations exactly when the end will come, as subsequent Jewish and Christian authors were all too eager to do, ancient Jewish writers were largely content to state that the precise moment of the end has been predetermined by God, even if the exact timing of that moment remains elusive. Thus, when Ezra asks the interpreting angel in 4th Ezra, "How long? When will these things be?" the angel replies, and I quote, "When the number of those like yourselves is completed. For God has weighed the age in the balance, and measured times by measure, and numbered the times by number, and he will not move or arouse them until that measure is fulfilled." The angel suggests that God has predetermined the exact duration of this world. The angel also implies that human behavior cannot alter, let alone accelerate, the divine time schedule. The author of 2nd Baruch goes a step further and hypothesizes exactly when it was that God predetermined the moment of the end. It happened when Adam transgressed the commandment, because when Adam sinned and death was decreed for those who are born, then the abundance of those to be born was counted, and for that number a place was prepared. There is another pervasive belief that what is wrong in this world will be made right in the next. No more disease and death, no more New York City congestion pricing, and the righteous will be rewarded for their righteousness at long last. The idea of a final redemption in the age to come is also found in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus responds to Peter and combines in his, that is, Jesus' prediction, inevitable persecution in this world with the reward of eternal life in the next. Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the good news, who will not receive 100-fold now in this age, houses, brothers and sisters, mothers, children, and fields with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life." Observation number 2, God and the absence of time. God is the master of time. God exists outside of time, is not subject to time, and maintains full control over time. Time has agency, and yet it remains obedient to the Creator. It does not violate the order of creation. In the Hebrew Bible, reflections about the passage of time begin as early as in the priestly creation account in Genesis 1. God creates the universe by bringing order to what in the beginning was formless and void. Chaos is transformed to become the cosmos. What sets the two apart, chaos and cosmos, are distinction and purpose. God creates by introducing a distinction between darkness and light, between night and day. And distinction, in turn, bestows meaning. Time, which in Genesis 1 is intimately tied to space, becomes meaningful because it is no longer undifferentiated. It is now segmented, and each segment, called day by our priestly author, has meaning and purpose. The biblical idea that the progression of time became meaningful at the moment of creation, when God divided time into identifiable time units, was picked up by the early Jewish apocalyptic thinkers. One of the oldest so-called historical apocalypses is the Enochic apocalypse of weeks. It famously divides all of world history into 10 weeks. The first week is the time of the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 5. The 7th week is the time of our actual author. And the 10th and final week is the time in the eschatological future, when, I quote, "the first heaven will pass away and a new heaven will appear." With week 10, the author has reached the end of time. But there's more. Following the 10th week, according at least to the last verse in the Apocalypse of Weeks, which is verse 17, time will continue, no longer in forms of weeks, but rather time reverts to an eternal and undifferentiated flow of time, just as it was prior to creation. 1, I quote, "After this there will be many weeks without number forever, in which they will do piety and righteousness, and from then on sin will never again be mentioned." In other words, the end will be like the beginning. Time will continue forever, uninterrupted, undifferentiated, and humanity will be sinless in an eternal state of bliss. God, who exists in the absence of time, is the creator of time. Our early Jewish thinkers, that meant that time has agency, like all of God's creatures. Just like them, time could possibly refuse its creator. But as our daily experience demonstrates, time chooses not to be disobedient, but to follow God's bidding. Thus writes the author of 2nd Baruch, "O Lord, you call the advent of times, and they stand before you. You cause the might of the ages to come, and they do not resist you. You guide the course of the seasons, and they obey you." Here, God summons time. Note the 3 references to time, ages, and seasons, all in parallelism. And time appears before God as if it were a person. Note also the three verbs: standing before God, not resisting God, and obeying God. God has assigned time its place in creation, just as God has assigned the other elements in the natural world their places. The implication is that God's involvement with time was not limited to the very beginning of creation. God continues to be involved with time, summons it, and guides it at will. This is not creatio ex nihilo, the idea that God created everything in the beginning, much like a clockmaker, and then withdrew, but rather creatio continua, God's continuous involvement in creation through God's mystery and mastery over time. In the imagination of our early thinkers, time unfolds in a linear fashion, and the moment of the end has already been determined by God. And yet, since God is the master over time, God can also accelerate the flow of time. The idea here is that God is capable of hastening the passage of time. Why would God want to do this? In order to bring about the final redemption sooner. The early writers imagined that this could happen in a number of ways. For instance, God could simply shorten specific time periods, such as the final installment of history. That idea is expressed poignantly in an exchange between the prophet Ezekiel and God in a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls labeled Pseudo-Ezekiel or 4Q 385. Here we find Ezekiel anxious. He pleads with God, I quote, "Let the days hasten quickly, that it may be said by man, indeed, the days are hastening on, so that the children of Israel may inherit. And the Lord said to me," this is Ezekiel, "I will not refuse you, O Ezekiel. I will cut the days and years a little, as you said, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken these things." Mindful of Ezekiel's angst regarding the end, God promises the prophet to cut short the remaining days or years of this age in order to bring about the restoration of Israel a bit sooner. The idea that God hastens the time that remains until the end is fairly widespread. Note the following passage taken from an apocryphal book known as Fifth Ezra, a Christian writing from the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. Here God is speaking to Ezra. "Tell my people that I will give them the kingdom of Jerusalem. Go and you will receive. Pray that your days may be few, that they may be shortened. The kingdom is already prepared for you. Be on the watch." Other than shortening the remaining time, God can also speed up the passage of time. This idea is articulated in form of a divine promise in 2nd Baruch. There God assures the seer, "Therefore see, the days are coming, the times will hasten more than the former, the seasons will run more than those that have passed, and the years will pass more quickly than the present ones." The acceleration of time is part of the divine promise to the seer that the end will come sooner than expected. The motif of time curtailing also appears in the Gospels. In Mark chapter 13, Jesus predicts unimaginable suffering during the final woes. Indeed, the times will be so grim, Jesus announces, that the only way for anyone to survive them is for God to cut short that period of time. I quote, "For in those days there will be suffering such as not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, no, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. For the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he has cut short those days." According to the Markan thesis, God will be merciful and cut short those days. And God will do so, this is the promise, for the sake of the righteous, whom Jesus calls the elect, those whom God has chosen. In other words, the righteousness of the few will save the many. It is for the sake of the elect that God will accelerate the progression of time. Observation number 3, human time. In their effort to give language to the passage of time, ancient Jewish writers did not settle on a few well-defined terms, each with a specific meaning. Instead, they made use of a wide array of terms and expressions. Their vocabulary of time is rich and variegated. A recurring theme in the language of time is movement. It isn't the believer who moves through time, however, as one might expect. It is time itself that moves toward them. Ancient writers set out to better understand the flow of time, to identify and distinguish between specific periods in time, and to securely locate themselves in the flow of time. They did all of this by various means, by dividing time into distinct periods and by producing various calendars. In 1962, James Barr, a remarkable Scottish Hebrew Bible scholar, published a little book titled Biblical Words for Time. In it, he collected and discussed Hebrew words for time and eternity, of which there are several. Since then, in the wake of the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the explosion of interest in the Jewish literature of the late Second Temple period, our appreciation for the enormously rich vocabulary of time in ancient Judaism has grown only further. On the slide, you see just a few terms related to time that are used by the author of Second Baruch. The same language, though, is found very widely in related texts. Many of these terms describe the transition from this age to the next. And it matters that we pay attention to the language of time. Second Baruch is an apocalypse, so perhaps not surprisingly, the book's apocalyptic vocabulary communicates what the British literary critic Frank Kermode has aptly called the sense of an ending, a feeling of urgency that time is coming to an end and that something new is about to break in. Since Aristotle, time has been linked to movement. Aristotle defined time as a measure of movement with regards to earlier and later. For him, the flow of time is simply a condition of this world. Ancient Jewish texts also know of the flow of time, but conceive of it differently. Here, it is not the individual person or object that moves through time. Rather, it is time itself that is constantly on the move and aimed toward the believer. Days are coming, already the biblical prophets proclaimed, and the advent of the seasons is not far off. There is something inevitable in this language, something pressing. Something is coming unceasingly, the great movement of time that triggers a sense of urgency in light of the imminent consummation of all. Ancient Jewish writers also believed that God had divided time into distinct periods, a phenomenon scholars have called the periodization of history. We already mentioned the anarchic apocalypse of weeks and its division of all of history into 10 weeks. Other periodization schemes are derived from the Hebrew Bible. Leviticus 25, for example, describes the institution of the Jubilee year. Its most famous use is in the Book of Jubilees, written in the 2nd century BCE. Another biblical example of the periodization of history is the Four Kingdoms scheme in the Book of Daniel, found in chapters 2 and 7. History will end in a succession of 4 kingdoms, each one more evil than the previous one. The Four Kingdoms scheme, which was adopted very widely by later Jewish and Christian authors, serves multiple purposes. It explains that the final installment of history was preordained by God. It describes how, as history is aiming towards its end, things are getting progressively worse. And it locates the reader close to the chronological end, with God's salvific intervention close at hand. Time, memory, and forgetting. Time is of fundamental importance to our sense of being in the world. Ancient Jewish writers were well aware of this and used time as a rhetorical device in multiple ways. One such way is what we call pseudepigraphy, writing a text under a pseudonym. Another is by imagining rather than remembering the past, not as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, but as it could have been. Time is fundamental to our sense of orientation in the world. Those of us who have lived or are currently living with a loved one who suffers from dementia know this all too well. Dementia takes away our sense of time, of when things happened. With the loss of memory comes the loss of orientation, a profound sense of insecurity, the feeling of being lost easily in place and time. This can be terribly disorienting and discouraging. One way in which ancient Jewish writers engaged with the dimensions of time in a playful way is through the use of pseudepigraphy. Many early texts, though particularly apocalyptic texts, share a common rhetorical device. They are pseudepigrapha, meaning their actual authors remain unknown, since these texts are written under a pseudonym, typically that of a biblical figure. The anonymous author picks up and continues to write in a particular literary genre that is identified and known by the name of its protagonist, Enoch, for example, or Abraham, Moses, Ezra, Isaiah, or Baruch. The reader will immediately recognize the name of the protagonist and associate with that name a certain theological or literary tradition. The pseudonymous name thus becomes shorthand for a writing style, a set of questions, certain kind of theology, a particular way of thinking. In many Jewish apocalyptic texts, the past is not simply reconstructed or remembered, as it would have been in a historical text. Rather, it is imagined, like you would imagine the future. Take the following example again from 2nd Baruch. Baruch has a vision in which he sees the entire history of ancient Israel divided into 12 periods. One of these periods is the time of Abraham. The angel Ramiel appears and describes to Baruch what he has seen. That's not what I wanted to show you. This is what you need to see. And after this, you, Baruch, saw bright waters. This is the fountain of Abraham, also his generations, and the advent of his son and of his son's sons, of those who are like him. Because at that time the unwritten Torah was named among them, the works of the commandments were accomplished, the belief in a future judgment was born, the hope for a world that will be renewed was built, and the promise of the life that is coming after this was planted. This is the bright water that you saw. Given how immensely popular the figure of Abraham was among early Jewish and Christian writers, it is quite striking that none of the aspects for which Abraham is commonly remembered is mentioned here. Abraham, the first monarch, Abraham's covenant with God, and Abraham's circumcision as a sign of that covenant, Abraham and the binding of Isaac, and so on and so forth. None of this is mentioned here. Instead, we read of a past that, at least according to the book of Genesis, never was. Abraham followed the unwritten Torah, meaning that Abraham was so perfect that he intuitively followed all the commandments of the Torah, long before Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai. Moreover, it was during the time of Abraham that eschatological beliefs in ancient Israel were first conceived. Modern reader of the Bible will be hard-pressed to find any of this in the book of Genesis. Indeed, the author of 2nd Baruch describes a biblical past that never was. It is Israel's past as the author of 2nd Baruch imagined it could have been. My fifth and last observation. Apocalyptic writers believe that they live during the final installment of history. For them, the end is imminent, which means that there is a particular urgency to act morally now, so as to be found worthy of entry into the age to come then. To the modern reader of the New Testament, this idea will be familiar, particularly from the epistles of Paul. New Testament ethics are largely an interim ethics for the relatively short period that remains between the now time and the parousia, the return of Christ. How are we in the 21st century to evaluate the ethical imperative in apocalyptic texts, which includes significant sections of the New Testament when in fact the end has not come as these authors had imagined it. The connection between time and ethics in ancient Judaism, in my opinion, has not received the attention it deserves. Much of the ethical advice we find in these texts is tied to the belief that the end of time was not far off. The perceived nearness of the end was the primary reason why these writers urged their readers to live ethically, honorably, and, according to at least some texts, detached from all worldly goods. The shortness of time that remains was of immediate ethical relevance and a great motivator to change one's ways of life. We see this expressed in a number of texts, such as in this passage from 6th Ezra, a Christian composition, possibly from the 3rd century CE. The calamities draw near and are not delayed. Prepare for battle, and in the midst of the calamities, be like strangers on earth. Let the one who sells be like one who will flee. Let the one who buys be like one who will lose. Let the one who does business be like one who will not make a profit. And let the one who builds a house be like one who will not live in it. Let the one who sows be like one who will not reap. So also the one who prunes the vines like one who will not gather the grapes. Those who marry like those who will not have children, and those who do not marry like those who are married. A similar sentiment is expressed by the Apostle Paul. In his first epistle to the Corinthians, Paul urges the Corinthians not to change their current marital status, since the time of this age is running out on them. Quote, I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short, for the present form of this world is passing away. Paul is even clearer about the nearness of salvation in Romans 13. Again, I quote, besides this, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near. Let us then lay aside the works of darkness and put on armor of light. Let us live honorably as in the day. Paul's ethical advice to live honorably as in the day is grounded above all in the expectation of the imminence of the end. Human behavior can no longer be shaped by the values of this world. Rather, the guiding principle of Paul's ethical advice is the parousia, the expectation that Christ will return soon, and the imperative to stay alert. Put differently, much of New Testament ethics are an interim ethics, intended for the short period of time that is left in between the now time and the inbreaking of the end, which Paul believed he would experience during his lifetime. But the eschatological future did not come. At least the end was not as imminent as Paul had thought it would be. Inevitably, the close connection between time and ethics raises difficult questions for our own scripture-based ethic today. If our moral compass is guided by scripture, as I believe it ought to be, then we need to confront the fact that New Testament ethics, not unlike much the Jewish ethics at the time, are essentially an interim ethic that were never intended for the believers of the 21st century. Put differently, if one of the central motivating factors for humans to change their behavior was the expectation of an imminent end, and if this expectation turned out to be an illusion, then what does that mean for the place of scriptural ethics in our own scripture-based moral reflection today? I would like to conclude with the so what question. Why should we care about how Jewish writers in antiquity thought about time and temporality? A close reading of the ancient texts reveals that Jewish intellectuals developed a keen interest in various aspects of time. They imagined the end of time and how it will be on the other side. They wrote about God and the absence of time. about God who can hasten the passage of time. They developed a new vocabulary of time. They devised different periodization schemes and various competing calendars. They imagined a collapse of the dimensions of time. They reimagined the scriptural past as it could have been. And they enacted the eschatological future as if it were here already and accessible to them. And they felt keenly that time was running out on them, which motivated them to live ethically and with integrity. The latter may seem to us today like a simple illusion, though with our own climate crisis and a sense that time might be running out on us too, it may not seem so wrong-headed after all. Many of these ways of thinking about time and enacting time we will not find in the Hebrew Bible. They appear for the first time in the period we call ancient Judaism. And like many other innovations from that era, they have changed Judaism and Christianity forever. Thank you.